In this module, we're going to cover configuring services, the core services of Windows 10, and we're going to focus more on network and storage on Windows 10 as it sits. The important thing to remember about configuring support and core services is there are a number of different features in the platform that need to be configured correctly for it to work the way you want it to. And we've listed out, for the exam purposes, what those topics are and how you can prepare for just those topics themselves. Everything from IPv4, IPv6, all the way down to direct access as a feature.
Yep.
Now, some of these solutions may be deprecated, but they're still relevant for the exam, so you should know exactly when and where to use those functionalities within the platform. We start off with looking at IPv4. And IPv4, again, is probably an age-old technology.
When was IPv4 introduced with Windows, right? I mean, this is forever. IPv4 is 30 years old.
It is the way to recognize PCs on the network.
Yep.
So IPv4 is our standard for providing addresses for systems, and probably the prerequisite to making sure that you can actually access resources in a network organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's terms that you'll need to know with IPv4, like automatic private IP addressing, the APIPA address. Now, you may get a question on the exam that goes something like, your user's IP address is shown in the display, and it starts with 169.254.something.something, 255.255.0.0 subnet mask. That's an automatic private IP address. If your DHCP server is unavailable to give an IP address, your client will automatically assign itself one in the 169.254 range. So you need to know that. Also, you need to know DHCP server, the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol server that hands out IP addresses.
Exactly. And again, that is a server functionality, but it's still important. The other thing you'll have to keep in mind is the difference between what we consider IPv4 and IPv6. Because of the naming standards, IPv4 and IPv6 have a different way of identifying, addresses within a network. However, they are used as two ways to indicate what your address is on the network. You can have both of them configured, and you can typically see that within your network settings if you go into the settings app as well.
You can even see it as I go into my machine. I'm going to open up a command prompt. I'm just going to type a very basic ipconfig. And I can see that I have my IPv6 address. That's the really long string broken down into all these different numbers and integers. And I have my IPv4 address. It says IPv4 10.121.121. So I can see here my IPv4 and my IP6 on the same network adapter. And as you said, you may have both of them configured, and I do have both of them configured here through DHCP, through Microsoft.
And DHCP now can actually allocate addresses for both DHCP IPv4 and IPv6. Yep. So those are options that you can actually configure DHCP, which is basically the idea that you're providing the device an IP address in the specific range or location of where that PC is plugged into within your network.
Now, something else you'll want to know about IPv4 and IPv6 is, again, on my machine, looking at my command prompt, I can do a ping, and I can just ping my local host address, and it's going to automatically do it as IPv6. That's the default. So you can see it as : 1. That's my IPv6 address. If I wanted to do it, ping localhost, and find out what my IPv4 address is, I can do 4, and it will tell me it is 127.0.0.1 as localhost. If I did it by my name, I'd actually get the actual address. So you can see different ways that I can determine what my IPv6 or IPv4 address is.
The other thing to keep in mind is knowing the difference between a simple network and a complex network. Again, because IP addresses are given out based on a specific range, a simple network might be just a range with a way of identifying it within a shorter a larger pool of addresses, whereas as you get complex, you start basically...
we know it as like CIDR notation, right? So you have the simple network might have a 255.255.255.0 subnet mask, or 255.0.0.0 subnet mask, where CIDR notation, 255.255.124.0, right? So now you're saying, okay, I have more subnets available to me through this subnet mask, but I have fewer IP addresses within each subnet. And it just allows you to expand out your one subnet mask into several smaller networks.
You may have a question or two around simple networks or complex networks, so know the difference between when you're dealing with one or the other. The third thing to be aware of is what we consider private IP addressing. So if you're dealing with having a private IP address range that is only available on a local system, for example, and we call that a PIPA address, automatic private IP addressing, is a way of giving or assigning your device
Auto-assigning your device an IP address it's non-routable.
non-writable address.
So I mentioned it a few minutes ago about your DHCP service simply unavailable. That's not always the case. It could be that you're in a small network and you just don't need a DHCP server. You have fewer than 250 machines that need to connect to each other, no routers. You just have them all do an IP, automatically get an IP address.
Exactly. Know the difference between Class A, Class B, and Class C networks. 10.0.0 is typically a Class A network. Class B is 172, and you'll see the address there, and 192 is a Class C address. So these address ranges really allow you to separate where your infrastructure is accessing resources. You can have a DMZ environment that's 172 in address. You can have an internal address that's 192, and another domain that's 10.0.0.
As long as your router can route between them, you're good.
Exactly. And so you'll see a lot of organizations use this as a way to route between different network environments in their organization. So they will test you on this, and they'll expect you to understand how each one of these work, and understanding also what ranges are, what subnet ranges are, and how they actually fit into the model of providing access based on that specific range.
Now, when you first get an IP address, so you enable your network card, whether it's in Hyper-V or it's on your physical network card, your big blue bar is going to pop up saying, what kind of network is this? Is this my domain network, my private network? Do you want to be discoverable on the network? So you can see we've listed out those network locations here as a domain network, a private network, or a guest network, and you can see the blue bar. We put the picture of it at the bottom. So basically the difference is if you're in a domain network, your machine's automatically going to be discoverable, meaning other machines on your network can search for you just by doing maybe a NetBIOS query. A private network, also you're discoverable, but it's typically a smaller network, maybe at home. A guest network, you go plug in at the local coffee shop or at the library, or somewhere else like that where you don't want to be discoverable. You don't want other machines to be able to discover your machine is there. So once you join a domain, you join your Active Directory domain, you're automatically going to be in the domain network. If you're in a work group, you can choose between private and guest network.
The other feature to think about is Windows firewalls. The Windows firewall and advanced firewalls are concepts that are also native to Windows 10. Making sure you know where to set those settings in your Windows 10 is crucial to the understanding of how to prepare for the exam. So we've done our best to make sure that we've shown you sort of the control panel location of where Windows Firewall can be found on your device. Now, we know a lot's changing. So with the Windows 10 platform, and a lot of these features are now being moved into the Settings app.
Right now, the firewall is one of those features that some things can be done in the classic control panel, and of course some things can be done in the Settings app. Probably in a future version of Windows it'll all be in the Settings app, or even just in the advanced firewall.
So the things to keep in mind around the firewall and the concepts around it is the fact that you can have 3 different networks, as Joe alluded to earlier: domain, private, public networks. And you can configure firewalls for each one of those networks depending on what you decide in your organization.
Again, when you join a guest network, for example, it's automatically discovery is turned off. You can't be discovered. But you could actually go into a firewall and actually get more granular on what's allowed. And of course, then there's the advanced firewall, which is also, it's one of our MMC consoles, which allows you to do, instead of just saying, okay, you're discoverable or not, you can say this specific traffic on this specific port is allowed in or allowed out. You can get very granular, like you can with a network appliance firewall.
We've also listed out a few commands that you can actually use for PowerShell. If we haven't stated this already, these PowerShell commands are also very relevant on the exam because of the fact that many of these solutions or features are being rewritten or configured to use these PowerShell commands. We want to make sure that you're aware of them. A good example is getting information around your firewall rules, or setting a set of firewall rules based on some policies that you decide on your environment. So we've listed some of these out. If you pulled up PowerShell and you ran the command on the Windows 10 box, you'd get a list of options. You can just type in get help space get net firewall rule, and you'll see a list of other options available.
Now, setting the firewall for this exam, you should notice in PowerShell that we have the very top one is a get. net firewall rule, and the bottom one is a set net firewall rule. Know the difference between get and set. Definitely for all of these Microsoft exams, that's one of the things they want to make sure you understand is the verb. Are you getting this, so you just want to list it out, or are you setting it, so you want to make it a policy? The other thing you want to note is we didn't put a command here for this, but net shell, the old net sh command, is still alive and well on Microsoft exams. So know how to set firewall rules through net shell as well.
Wi-Fi settings and Wi-Fi Direct are also components that you can actually build into your operating system as well. Oh, they're built in, of course. Now you don't have to built in, but knowing what options you need to select. And so what we've shown is a set of different ways to deal with Wi-Fi settings. So if you have different modes, we can have ad hoc, Wi-Fi Direct, where you're basically directly connecting to a Wi-Fi setting, or an infrastructure-based configuration. We also have standards where we can use the 802.11 standard as a configuration for Wi-Fi and as well as infrastructure, and then Wi-Fi security. What sort of Wi-Fi security are we setting? Are we using a web key? Are we using a Wi-Fi protected access where you have a specific area that's protected, or using WPA2? They will test you on the differences and understanding when you'd actually use it. So remember, WEP is an older wireless security standard and a number of documented security issues surround it. So using WEP you only want to use that if that's
there's no choice, right? If there's no other option, you can use WEP. But most of us are going to be using WPA2. It's the de facto standard for Wi-Fi security.
Right, and with WPA, there's either both personal and there's also enterprise. And those two options are optional for you to decide whether or not you want to use the enterprise version of WPA or use a personal settings for WPA. So we've also shown exactly where you'd actually configure it. This is a newer platform on Windows 10 that allow you to decide on whether you have your Wi-Fi settings on, whether you're going to use hotspots, because again, hotspots is something that I think you might actually see on the exam because it's a newer feature.
Not only that, but with Windows 10, because it's Windows 10 Mobile as a hotspot is actually really good.
Exactly.
So you may see that as well.
And lastly, the paid Wi-Fi services. If you need to get online when you're on by using some sort of paid Wi-Fi services, you can actually enable it and use that to manage your payments for the Wi-Fi access.
Yeah, troubleshooting network issues. There's not a lot of anything new here. You're still going to do an IP config. You're going to do a ping. You're going to do all the old commands that you're used to. I showed you one of the things you can do with ping is you can just say, I want to know what my IP address, my IPv4 ping is, so you do a -4. So know the scope of the issue. Is this affecting everyone on your LAN? Is it affecting just you, just one or two machines? Check your infrastructure. Make sure your routers are working. Make sure your IP helpers are working. Make sure your DHCP server is working. So understand the IP address, understand the scope of that problem, again, and this other infrastructure as well. And test communication by doing a ping or an IP config or an ARP or any, the normal standard network commands. So we have a practice question here for you. So raise your hand if you know this question. You are the help desk technician at Contoso. A user calls you because they are unable to access a resource on server 1. You ask the user for the IP address of the computer and walk the user through getting you that information. The user's IP address is displayed to the right. What should you do? Again, so you would have a display there. And you can see here in this case, IPv4 address, you have a WINS proxy enabled, IP routing enabled. You want to look at the whole picture. And so do you want to A, add a default gateway? Do you want to B, enable IP routing? Do you want to C, check the DHCP server to see if it's online? Or D, check the DNS server to see if it's online? We talked about 169.254 is a PIPA, which means there's no DHCP server available. So the answer here is C.
Check the DHCP server to see if it's online and has IP address. That kind of gives you an idea of what we're dealing with networking. The other side of this is storage. So we talked about networking, DHCP, DNS, IP addressing, PIPA addresses. Storage is another side of Windows 10 that actually allows you to manage the disk, whether you're running a VHD, whether you're dealing with storage spaces, or whether you're troubleshooting storage. So this portion also covers what configuration is required when you're dealing with Windows 10 storage. The first and probably the most important place to look for information is on the disk management console. Yep. So if you type in disk mgmt.msc on your device, it will bring up your disk management configuration. Understand the terms that we've listed here. Volumes. What are volumes? How are they configured and used on a device? You can have mirrored volumes, you can have spanned volumes, you can have striped
Most of
volumes.
us think of this console right here. You look at the Disk Management MMC and you're thinking, oh, that's a server thing. My servers are going to have mirrored volumes or spanned volumes or striped volumes. My desktops aren't going to have that, but that's not the case, right? In a smaller company, your Windows 10 machine might be acting as a server, hosting certain roles, and you do want to span the disk, or you do want to mirror the disk for fault tolerance and whatnot. So make sure you're familiar with this, even if you're not a server admin.
Exactly. So volumes are basically designed to allocate storage to a specific space. So you can allocate it in different formats, whether if you're thinking about mirrored means I have this volume of data and I've made a copy of it and had it available on a second copy of of a disk. Striped might be having the data written across 3 or 4 different disks, and span means I have a volume that has the data across multiple disks as well. So know when you're going to use one versus the other and when they matter. The disk partitions, again, with the newer format, GPT, grid partition tables, are also very important. Master boot records, or MBRs, are the older formats of using disks. They're still relevant, they still work. They're just not as expandable as the grid partition tables of the GPT.
That's right. And we talked about in an earlier series about going from BIOS to UEFI, and that's part of that as well. It's going from the GPT, or going from MBR to GPT. That's part of that BIOS to UEFI transition as well.
Exactly. And so GPT, again, one of the main differences is that you can actually have disks that are larger than 2 gigabytes in space. That's also important because now your disk size can actually be much larger without having to worry about it working the way you want to. And this is also important when you're dealing with VHDs because if you set your GPT, you can actually have you can set it as a GPT. You can actually have bigger disks when you're using VHDs as well. Then also keep in mind what file system you're running. So NTFS, FAT32, FAT, extensible FAT drive. So file attribute. I can't remember what the T stands for, but
It's funny.
these are different
file allocation table.
File allocation table. There you go. Yeah, I gotta write that.
That was a Windows NT when I, back in the day. There's not a lot of FAT anymore, FAT32. It's all been NTFS ever since.
NTFS is the default, file system that's typically used in your organization. But now you're seeing a lot more with the Windows 10 talk about ReFS.
ReFS, yeah.
ReFS being your recovery options around, if a disk fails or if a file fails, it can actually, deal with that in a much more resilient manner. It's a resilient file system is all it is, and it's just there. It does a better job of checking for corruption on the actual file itself. So know the differences between NTFS, FAT32 when you use one versus the other. And the last thing is to remember what your disk management tools are. We have disk management as an option. We showed you that as a screen right now. And then there's also the Windows PowerShell, which you can actually use to programmatically configure settings. And lastly, DiskPart.
Which is, again, it's old school, but it still works. It's very scriptable, so you can push out disk configurations as well, or you can have it as part of your task sequence to create partitions by using a DiskPart command.
Now, virtual disks also are a big portion of Windows 10. Even though we talk about them for Server 2016, you can actually use that as well in Windows 10 because of the fact that you're able to leverage what we call storage spaces. Now, storage spaces, again, allow you to save a number of files to 2 or more drives and help protect that information across those different drives. And it lets you just easily add more drives if you run low on a specific drive, or if you have an issue. You can just basically link those drives and make that change so that the data remains accessible amongst those drives. So think about it as a virtual disk where you're taking a bunch of disks, and we call them JBODs, right? Assigning them to the Windows 10 operating system, and then saying, treat these as a single drive.
As a single drive letter.
And then you can literally carve out of those 3 hard disks, virtual disk that are now assigned to a specific drive letter. So if the data is written there, it will retrieve it from, it might be on disk 1 or disk 2 or disk 3, but because it's a virtual disk, you can actually retrieve it. So that ability to kind of provide that flexibility is something you'll be challenged on, knowing when to actually use the storage spaces and make that available on the platform. And it's very easy, very simple to configure, but the benefits is now you can actually check for storage space. You can actually see if you're running out of space and decide on options on how to make sure that you don't run into issues when it comes to disk usage. Now, the other thing to think about is the options around what we call thin provisioning or thick provisioning. Now, thin provisioning is I'm going to allocate a set of space on the storage, but I'm not going to fully allocate that disk drive to that space. So it really is a thin provisioning. It shows that it has 2 terabytes available, but it will only use what you put on it. And as you add more data to it, it utilizes it or pulls it over from wherever it needs to make up that thin provision. Thick provisions means I'm going to basically allocate 2 gigabytes or whatever number of disk space to this specific drive. And at that point, that thick provisioning gives me the knowledge that the data will always be there, the space will always be there regardless of what I do to actually put information on there. So know the difference between thin and thick provisioning. Understand when you're going to deal with simple 2-way, 3-way mirroring, because again, mirroring might help out when you're dealing with multiple drives, or if you're dealing with what we call parity. Parity means if you have 3 disks and for some reason you lose one of those disks, you can easily at some point decide on whether or not you want to replace disk 2 or disk 3 and get things back up and
Without
running.
losing your data is the important part.
Exactly. So storage spaces are very important in this piece. And the last thing is configuring data access and usage. We think about Windows 10 and the files and printers, the folder shares, the file systems that we have on there, in addition to the OneDrive or any location where we're actually going to store data, also becomes very important. So this section basically covers the importance of making sure you know how to deal with the file shares and all the different scenarios around file access. It covers folder permissions, which is an age-old technology. It uses a server message block, which allows you to decide on what types of permissions that you provide users based on their role and where they need access to on a specific document.
Now, one thing that's important to note with shared folder permissions is it actually, and you mentioned server messenger block, SMB, it actually only works over the network. So if I connect to server 1, start to run WAC server 1 or to map drive, and I go to the share permissions are counted against my access or towards my access. But if I RDP into that server and browse through File Explorer, then the share permissions don't do anything for me. That's only NTFS permissions at that point. So the share permissions are only over the network.
So we covered network, we covered file storage, and we covered as well as the file access. So these are 3 different areas within the platform that you have to kind of be aware of once you have your Windows 10 up and running. They're all part of making sure you have access to the storage and network configuration and a number of different tools.
And remember, we've mentioned that OneDrive is a big part of this, so make sure you understand how OneDrive works if you're not using it, because just because we didn't have a slide on it doesn't mean it's not important. It's a very big part of this exam. This section, this whole Module 1 section is 30% of the exam, and OneDrive is a piece of that as well.
Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll hope you enjoyed the section.